Last year or something, I published a video debunking some of the most common myths about pirates from the Golden Age, and funnily enough, though this video caused some aggravation from all directions, most commonly it regarded something as uncontroversial as eye patches. I was going to say harmless in the initial draft of the script. Well, if you're wearing an eye patch, some sort of harm was done. Or maybe the eye patch was worn as a tactical choice. A lot of people claim that eye patches were worn by pirates to enhance their vision in the dark decks below. The amount of misconceptions about pirates and eye patches has facilitated the need for an entire video dedicated to exploring the subject. I will talk about eye injuries, patches, our cultural association of pirates and eye patches, and finally, about the possibility of pirates using eye patches to enhance their vision in the darkness. So before you write an angry comment trying to rebook any statements in the video, watch until the end, or skip to one of the chapters covering whatever you're interested in. Eye injuries have always been common with any violent walk in life. Get into a bar fight, get a black eye. Get into a sword fight, they'll be stabbing for the eyes. One-eyed brutes have been associated with maritime stories since the Odyssey. Polyphemus, king of the Cyclops and son of Poseidon, was blinded by Odysseus after the latter stabbed the Cyclops' eye with a heated stick. Fast forward to the Age of Sail, and such injuries were made part and parcel of a warrior's life, on land and sea alike. The discovery and conquest of Mexico by Bernal Diaz described two conquistadors who had lost their eyes in battle. Throughout the period, we have maritime heroes disfigured in combat. Most famous would be Horatio Nelson. Another example is the Spanish admiral, Blas de Lezo. He was famous for defending Cartagena de Indias against an English invasion in 1741. If you want a pirate with a missing eye, a quick Wikipedia search will show us Rahma ibn Jabir al-Jalhami, an Arab pirate active in the Persian Gulf during the early 1800s. The pirate's own book, written by Charles Elms just 11 years after Rahma's death, described him as follows. Rahma ben Jabir's figure presented a meager trunk, with 4 lank members, all of them cut and hacked. He had, besides, a face naturally ferocious and ugly, and now rendered still more so by the several scars there, and by the loss of one eye. Turning back the clock to the golden age of piracy, I can think of 2 pirates with missing eyes. The most famous would be Olivier Levasseur, a dashing Frenchman most known for his multitude of unique flags, and partaking in one of history's richest heists. A less famous but much more graphical account comes from the final days of Philip Lyne, described by the Boston Gazette in 1726. The commander went ahead with about 20 other pirates. As they were much wounded and no care taken in dressing, they were very offensive and stunk as they went along, particularly Lyne the commander. He had one eye shot out, which with part of his nose hung down on his face. Interestingly, none of the mentioned individuals were ever described as wearing eye patches. During the period, individuals with eye injuries wore patches for 2 reasons. Firstly, if the wound was fresh, the patch would protect it from infection. Secondly, cosmetic. A scar is not the prettiest thing to look at, especially for civilians who are kinda scared by that stuff. And we do have a lot of depictions from the entire period of sailors wearing eye patches. This one shows Joseph Burgin, a pensioned sailor who lost an eye and a leg in service of the Navy. There are similar pictures of pensioned Navymen with missing limbs and eye patches. Note here that they're pensioned. They're not at sea, they're retired, comfortable, and within civil society. It wouldn't exactly be proper to walk around with an ugly scar, especially when trying to pick up a lady with your swashbuckling stories. Some of these stories may have been how the sailor lost his eye. The most common cause behind eye injuries were splinters. Owing to the Mythbusters, some people believe that splinters would not cause significant damage to a person. According to historian Bennis and Little, the test parameters of the Mythbusters episode were, quote, simply incorrect. In his blog, he provides photographs from the Maritime Museum in Erie, Pennsylvania, where an experiment was conducted aboard the flagship Niagara to test the deadliness of splinters. And yeah, even aboard lighter vessels under fire by smaller guns, a swarm of lesser splinters striking soft tissue like the eye would certainly have been enough to put it out of commission. This is besides the countless period accounts of the damage done by splinters, and the constant stressing in period manuals to prepare precautions against them, such as hanging up mattresses along the interior of the hull. But I doubt the fine lady would want to hear too much of these horrific stories. Well, there's a saying in the army that civilians tire of military tales after 10 minutes. The point is, eye patches seem to mostly have been a cosmetic. And out at sea or in the field, it's doubtful that a soldier, sailor, or pirate cared. Eye patches were uncomfortable, would create pressure, sweat, possibly fall off. So when at sea, it might be easier to stow it in your sea chest and keep it for those special occasions, right next to your bottle of Axe body spray. Or maybe alligator glands, which a few pirates actually kept as perfume. Alternatives to eye patches were sometimes used. Beggars and poor sailors are sometimes depicted with bandages or cloths just swathed around their eye. This image from the late 17th century shows German Field Marshal Johann Karl von Tüngen wearing an eye patch without a string to secure it. This means the patch would have been secured with some sort of adhesive, such as isinglass, which was commonly used for plasters. Indeed, beauty patches weren't only used for covering up eye injuries. For example, King William III encountered a soldier covering his facial scar with a patch and told him not to do so, because, quote, "It's more honorable in a soldier to wear a scar than a patch." But most people didn't have battle scars. Naval Secretary Samuel Pepys used a patch to cover a large cold sore. Patches were most commonly used to cover the horrific sores caused by syphilis. These patches are most often seen in the satirical paintings made by Hogarth, which often poke fun at human relations and conditions. In this painting we find an adulterous husband and a prostitute, both marked by the lover's pox. It will come as no surprise that syphilis was incredibly common among pirates, which is why archaeologists have found medicine against it in pirate shipwrecks like the Queen Anne's Revenge. Liquid mercury administered by a syringe, up the urethra. Next time wear a condom, which again actually existed in the period, but they weren't made from rubber, they were made from sheep intestines. Sailors and eye patches became a common trope in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, owing to the growth of mass media and plenty of pensioned veterans maimed in the Napoleonic Wars. The image on screen was created between 1838 and 1848. It's a costume illustration of a sailor character for the carnival in Paris. Images like this, and this watercolor from a bit earlier, shows us that the iconic eye patch was not merely relegated to pirates. So, how did those two become associated? The first source is actually pretty old. In 1678, Alexandre Exquemelin published his book, The Buccaneers of America, which would lay the foundations for the Western perception of Golden Age pirates. It is through the different editions of this book that we get our colorful vision of a brutal rogue in a big feathered hat and dashing clothes, more than 200 years before Hollywood slapped it onto the big screen. In this book, Exquemelin describes the Articles of Agreement signed between the Buccaneers. They concern such matters as provisioning, payment, and compensation for injuries. Allow me to cite you. Lastly, they agree what rate each one ought to have that is either wounded or maimed in his body, suffering the loss of any limb, as, for the loss of a right arm, 600 pieces of 8, or 6 slaves, and so on and so on. For an eye, 100 pieces of 8, or 1 slave. For a finger, the same as for an eye. Compensation for injuries was nothing invented by Exquemelin. We have independent examples of pirate articles describing this law, such as William Kidd's. This system was expected among pirates, likely because national navies offered pensions to maimed seamen, and pirates didn't want to be worse off than those they looked down upon. Some historians have discussed how many pirates actually had missing eyes. There are very few period descriptions of pirates with such injuries, especially in relation to their media popularity. But the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. However, a missing eye hinders both your sailing and fighting abilities. Some pirates may have pushed on anyway, or found other employment as a cook or a musician. This was very common in the Navy and Merchant Marine, for example. Or he could take his pension, his plunder, and retire comfortably. 19th century authors have been the most responsible in shaping our popular perception of pirates. They drew inspiration both from their contemporary maritime culture, literature, and historical sources, resulting in a confusing mix of fact and fiction. I do not know which author first depicted a pirate with an eye patch. The earliest example I could find was Charles Dickens, who in 1857 described one as follows. From a spy hole, I could see the whole crowd of pirates. Among the last, him with the one eye and the patch across the nose. Treasure Island, written by Robert Louis Stevenson in 1881, did not feature any one-eyed pirate. However, one of the antagonists include Blind Pew, whose condition you can probably guess. he lost his eyes in a broadside and was reduced to beggary. Still one of the more terrifying characters in the book, and he receives excellent portrayal in big screen adaptations like Takarajima and the 1990 version, where he's played by that wizard dude who really dislikes people from Saxony. Of course, Treasure Island also features the one-legged Long John, further honing home the image of a crippled cutthroat, be it limb or lights. A somewhat forgotten but highly influential novel in shaping our image of the pirate was Captain Blood, written in 1922 by Raphael Sabatini. One of Captain Blood's associates is described as follows. From the buccaneers at the foot of the steps came an angry rumble of approval. The single eye of the gigantic Wolverstone rolled terribly, and he clenched his great fists as if to strike the Frenchman, who was exposing them to mutiny. Of course, Wolverstone did not lose his eye at sea, but at the Battle of Sedgemoor during the Monmouth Rebellion. Sabatini drew heavily from historical sources, and in the 1935 movie adaptation, we even see the pirates compensated for their injuries. We don't see any of them compensated with slaves, however. Eye patches and wounded eyes are an effective literary device for pirates. It gives them a scary appearance and shows their experience in close-quarter combat. For this reason, eye patches became the cornerstone of pop culture pirates, until it was made obligatory. Today, some pirates, like Pintle in Pirates of the Caribbean, are depicted as having prosthetic eyes. Pintle's eye is made from wood, but historically, glass eyes were also used. There's a persisting idea running around the internet that pirates may have worn eye patches to enhance their vision in the darker levels of a ship. The theory works as follows. Pirates would spend most of their time on the bright and sunny weather deck, and when needing to go below for whatever reason, they would need a lot of time to adapt their eyes to the darkness. By keeping one eye covered, it would be kept in a state of readiness for night vision. So when they went below deck, they would switch the eye which had the patch covered. It did not improve your maximum night vision, it would still be dark and hard to see anything. You would just be adjusted to it quicker. It is very unlikely that someone would have discovered this in pre-industrial times. It's easy enough to figure out that your eyes need about 25 minutes to adapt to darkness, sure, but not so easy as to figure out that they adapt separately, nor how they adapt or why they adapt separately. Photoreceptors, which are responsible for this function, were discovered during the Golden Age of piracy, but their function wasn't understood until 1834. It is incredibly unlikely that someone in the period would have gone through all the small steps necessary to conceptualize this theory or discover it by accident. You would need two eyes, for some reason wear an eye patch, wait 25 minutes, go into a dark place, and then switch the patch to the other eye. Who the fuck would do that? And you're seriously telling me that out of all people, a pirate would be the one to discover it? It was only in 1934, 100 years after the understanding of photoreceptors, that a medical journal described this theory and called it the pirate's patch.
Oh yeah guys, clear evidence that pirates used it!
This was the same time that pirate novels and movies had their golden age, so it's no surprise that most people would have associated the eye patch with the popular depiction of their favorite seafaring scoundrels, rather than any historical precedent. The technique was then tested by the US Navy, and is nowadays used by aircraft pilots, and some guy in my comments section when he goes camping, and this is apparently evidence for pirates doing it 300 years ago. Yeah, by the way, this is the kind of people I have to deal with on a daily basis. The final nail in the coffin was the Mythbusters episode from 2007, where they tried this method out. They built an obstacle course where the hosts had to complete certain tasks in complete darkness. In the first run they did it with their eye adjusted to the light, and the run went pretty bad. In the second run, they did it with the eye covered by the patch and adjusted to darkness, and they were able to complete all the tasks and much faster. The final verdict for the myth was plausible. So what does this mean? It means that you can see better in darkness by using this method. It does not prove that pirates or anyone else historically used this technique, and it certainly doesn't prove it was feasible during boarding combat, because boarding combat did not consist of a single guy walking into an obstacle course and stabbing paper targets that didn't fight back. And yeah, someone in the comments section is gonna tell me,
"Oh well, that is obvious, I knew that."
No, it's not fucking obvious to everyone. There are people claiming this shit to me every day.
I have to preface this by saying that this episode is not a diss or an attack on Mythbusters, or even a critique. They are an entertainment show. I do not take them seriously. This video is pointed at the people who take this goofy show as genuine research material. The Mythbusters are not historians. They are not scholars, they are not experts in the age of sail or golden age of piracy. Serious historians like Bennis and Lill have discredited their work. If the eye patch trick was a widespread practice, we would know about it. Individuals like Jacob Bucoy or William Snellgrave, who were captured by pirates, would have described them putting on eye patches when going below deck or when boarding a ship. Charles Johnson would have caught wind of it and included it in his general history of the pirates, like he did other obscure pirate tendencies. The guy was starving for cool stuff to write about pirates. If this practice was really effective, it would have spread to the Navy and Merchant Marine. Eye patches would have appeared in journals, in manuals on how to fight at sea, in inventory lists for equipment. But they don't. There are hundreds, thousands of people, both published historians and amateurs, who have sifted through countless period documents to research this period. No one has discovered evidence for eye patches used in this manner. And why pirates specifically? Why not regular sailors or navymen? And this was an age before electricity. Everyone lived in low light conditions, often houses with nothing but wooden hatches for windows, if anything at all. When do we ever hear it suggested that milkmaids wore eye patches for when they went down the cellar? And coal miners going in and out of mine shafts? Why pirates specifically? When historians want to learn more about a topic, they either study documents or archaeological remnants, find evidence of something, and then dig deeper for additional findings to learn more about it. For example, muskets. A person who knows nothing about period weaponry can read one journal, find a mention of muskets, and maybe a basic description of them and their usage. By reading multiple period documents, you can start to notice a pattern and paint a picture. You can then find archaeological remnants or even a wholly intact musket and start connecting the dots. The eye patch's night vision theory works in the completely opposite direction. You try to take a modern notion and force it into a completely different time and place without any evidence to back up your claims. Apart from the fact that movies and authors like to portray pirates with missing eyes. And those who make this claim obviously know next to nothing about sailing, ships, or boarding tactics, because if they did, they'd realize how idiotic this meme is. Firstly, by blinding one of your eyes, you reduce your depth perception. When working the complex machinery of a constantly moving 18th century ship, when climbing high into masts, this is incredibly dangerous. In a fight, it's just as dangerous. Which is why one-eyed individuals are typically disqualified from fighting positions in armed forces today. Secondly, people in an age before electricity were more used to low-light conditions. Not to mention that the lower decks of a ship weren't even dark. These decks were entered through large, square holes called hatches. The hatches were placed in a vertical line from the top deck to the lowest, so that cargo could easily be lifted from out of the hold. The hatches also served the purpose of ventilating the lower decks, and for providing light. What if the hatches were closed? That's why they were grated, allowing light and air to escape through. During a storm, the hatches were covered up with tarpaulins secured by battens, hence batten down the hatches. The sailors would then take cover below deck. A storm would darken the sky, so they'd already have better night vision, without the need for patches, and they could also use a nifty invention called lanterns. Candles, lit flames, and pipes were not allowed below deck for risk of starting a fire. But a lantern was allowed, since it's a candle kept safe behind glass, as were pipes if they had a cap on. Lanterns could be carried by hand, but were also kept hanging from the roof below deck, like lamps. One of my commenters said the following: "You wouldn't bring a flame lantern into a room of gunpowder," which is what the Mythbusters were actually saying the eye patch might be a better option for. Okay, let's check out a period description of the magazine, the room where the gunpowder is stored aboard a ship. The best one I could find is from the Universal Dictionary of the Maritime, written in the mid-1700s, and is freely available online. Magazine, sous poudre, a closed room or storehouse, built in the fore or after part of the ship's hold, to contain the gunpowder used in battle, etc. This apartment is strongly secured against fire, and no person is suffered to enter it with a lamp or candle. It is therefore lighted, as occasion requires, by means of the candles or lamps which are fixed in the light room contiguous to it. aka, there was a room right next to the magazine used for providing light. It was further described as follows. Lightroom, Fanal du Sud, a small apartment enclosed with the glass windows, near the magazine of a ship of war. It is used to contain the lights by which the gunner and his assistants are unable to fill the cartridges with powder to be ready for action. Eye patches were not necessary, and if the magazine did not have a light room, the dictionary also described lampion, a small lamp, used to enter the ship's magazine. Magazines could also have their entry situated close to another hatch. We can look at this 1742 illustration of a merchant sloop, a type of ship very commonly used by pirates and just about anyone in the New World. As you can see, the hatch leading to the magazine is located just below the hatch to the top deck, meaning you would have had a constant supply of sunlight. What about boarding combat? For the most part, sea battles were decided before the pirates entered. They would overwhelm the enemy with firearms and artillery. If it came to a boarding, it was usually decided on the weather deck. Battles below deck were quite rare. And it wasn't the darkness that made them dangerous, because, it wasn't that dark. Rather, it was closed quarters. These were fortified positions in the front and back of merchant ships, from which they could fire at the assailants through loopholes, often in a crossfire. The TV series Black Sails presented it rather well, and as you can see, they also provide a correct light level. Note also how you get light from the gun ports. But you might say, what if they fought at night? Then you'd have plenty of time to adapt your night vision, because it would be dark everywhere. Night would come slowly, sure, but sea battles were slow-paced. They could take hours, even days. It would still be hard to see for everyone, but yeah, that's life. And the eye patches don't improve your maximum night vision. Pirates had multiple methods at their disposal for fighting below deck. For one, they didn't fight one-on-one, like in the Mythbusters experiment. If they went below deck, they would do so in groups. So you could have several guys carrying swords, pistols, and muskets, and one guy carrying a lantern. I wonder why modern military and police forces use flashlights on their guns.
Hey guys, don't you know about the pirate eye patch method?
And just like modern military forces, boarding parties used grenades. Now, some expert told me that grenades hadn't been invented yet, so I have to explain what grenades pirates used. They went by a lot of different names that often changed meaning, but at its very basic, they consisted of an outer shell filled with projectiles and gunpowder. The grenade was then stoppered, and before it was thrown, the stopper was pulled out and replaced with a burning rope fuse, and the grenade thrown. Some grenades were made from clay, others from iron. Some were large and contained many smaller grenades. Some contained flammable substances, others were just glass bottles with gunpowder and nails. They were called grenados, firepots, fireworks. Another type was the stink pot, a sort of proto-gas grenade used for flushing out. There's a lot more to be said about pirate fireworks, and I've got an entire video about it coming out next year. It's gonna be pretty whack, but for the purposes of this one, this is all you need to know. So how were the grenades used? If you entered a low light or just confined environment, you'd light a grenade and throw it inside, just to flush out potential enemies. Some were even small enough to be thrown through the loopholes in closed quarters. If pirates couldn't reach the closed quarters, they could breach it from above by tearing holes with axes and crows, and then lob grenades through the hole. And if this didn't work and they still couldn't breach the close quarters, they could destroy the merchant's sails and rigging, clear the lines, steer their ship behind or in front of the merchant, where the ship's infrastructure was the weakest, and just shoot down along the length of her, into the close quarters. Basically, pirates had every tool at their disposal to make night vision eye patches completely unnecessary. As a summary, eye injuries were very common among the violent professions during the Age of Sail. When interacting with civilians or polite society, it was common to cover such injuries with a patch, and patches were widely used in general against any blemish. There exists no evidence of anyone before World War II using eye patches to improve their vision, which was completely unnecessary with the technology of the time, and even crippling to the one using it. But if you can find a period source describing eye patches used in this manner, I will be glad to make an update. Saying, "It makes sense," isn't enough. It makes sense for us to frequently wash our hands. It didn't 300 years ago. Back then, bloodletting made sense for curing gout or even combat wounds. And there are things that make sense to us today, which research will prove dangerous in just a few years. Or maybe even tomorrow. Some people will also call me smug or a smartass for making these sorts of debunking videos, but frankly, I don't enjoy making them. There are other subjects I'd rather cover than having to put out fires, which is why I'm so angry in these sorts of videos. Anyway. Huge thanks to my generous channel members and Patreon supporters. In particular, Cole Freer, Max Dweck, 1660, Michaela Jans, Daniel Stryker, Sea-Dog, Randall DeVere, Old Man Zed, Krillov, Nick Hooper, and Captain Jake Rumdrinker. If you'd like to hang out with fellow part enthusiasts, please check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Hope to see you there. Cheers!